Okay, hello everybody. I'm very pleased that Duke could join me. I didn't know if he would be able to make this conference. Duke and I have been doing trainings about restorative justice for several years now. So we're going to do the quick version of a training that usually takes us several days. The first thing I want to say about restorative justice really picks up from a note that David Kaczynski shared with us last night about the need for us to think about victims, and I'll do that by way of just a brief story, and then Duke will introduce himself and also share a brief story. We have a couple of different film clips we want to share with you. We want to invite you to be involved in discussion throughout. Several years ago, I was teaching a criminal justice class at Skidmore, and at the beginning of class, I took a look at one of the students, and she just looked miserable. She looked exhausted and very out of sorts. And I said, you know, what's happening? What's the matter? And she told us, the class, that she had this experience where over the weekend she was living off campus in a house with 3 other students, Skidmore girls, and they were all gone at different places that night. She was home alone, and she woke up at about 3 o'clock in the morning and realized somebody was in the apartment and had broken in. And so she just pretended to stay asleep, and she was terrified, and luckily the person came, stole some things, and left, and never entered her room. But she was stayed up the rest of the night, was very panic-stricken over that. And then the next night, she was home with all of her housemates and maybe a few other friends in their living room, and they had a large plate glass window. It was about 11 p.m., and they saw a face pop up outside the window and realized that there's somebody that was staring at them, and so they got panicked all over again, and so she really hadn't slept since and was beside herself, and so she had gone to see our Dean of Student Affairs to see what kind of help she could get. And he was, he suggested all the right things. You could go to the counseling center, you should talk to your landlord, you should obviously be speaking with the police, but basically gave the message that because she was an off-campus student, this was an off-campus incident, this was really a police matter and not a matter for Skidmore College to address. She was essentially on her own. And so she was in class out of sorts and not knowing what to do. And so I turned it to the class and I said, okay, well, what would you like to see happen? This is a criminal justice class, and here is a criminal case right here. What would you like to see? What should happen? And the class immediately started brainstorming, and they went right where you might suspect, which was thinking about the police and how the police should stake out the apartment, and that they could have these cameras, and that they could catch the guy and then put him in jail. And I said, well, I don't think the police are going to do that, because there's not much to go on. They don't have the resources for that. And anyway, we have this concept called restorative justice, which is about really trying to meet the needs of the crime victims. So in her case, what is she really asking for here, and would that solve her problem? And then we had a very different conversation, and we discovered in further inquiry with her that one of the things she was upset about was that the lock on her front door was broken and hadn't been working for about a month, and she had had trouble with getting the landlord to be responsive, and that was one of the reasons that she was particularly frightened, was that people could just walk into the house. And one of the kids in the class said, "Oh, I know how to change a lock. If you take me over to Home Depot after class, and if you're willing to buy the replacement lock, I could change it, like in 2 hours, you could have a workable lock. You don't have to wait for the landlord to respond." So we checked that off the list. Another thing that she was upset about was that after this incident, this next several nights, all the girls were too scared to sleep at the apartment. So some were sleeping at friends' houses or boyfriends' houses, and that she had spent another night at the apartment alone. So they were not well coordinated in taking care of each other or being safe in the apartment. And so the class cooked up a scheme where they would make sure that she had a schedule and knew that who was sleeping over when, and that if there was any night when any one of them was going to be alone, they gave her all of their cell phone numbers, and they said, okay, at least 3 of us would come over right away, and we would be with you that night in the apartment. So if you're afraid of being home alone, problem solved. So they started coming up with answers that were very different from the "we will catch the bad guy and put him in jail," answers that started to really meet her needs around the issues that she was most immediately concerned about. So that started me thinking about how restorative justice is a very different way of thinking about what justice requires.
Yes. Good afternoon. How's everybody? I wanted to share how I got involved with restorative justice with David. We had worked many years together establishing mediation projects in Saratoga Springs, and there was this idea that had germinated that we had a lot of parenting conflict that actually made its way to the courts. And David had a group of students that wanted to learn about mediation, and I was teaching mediators how to mediate disputes. And so he said, this is what we'll do. We'll take college students and have them mediate with adult mediators for the courts. And you have an adult mediator and a college mediator, and together they would help families discuss these issues. So we did that for a long time, successful project, watching Skidmore students help families work through these conflict discussions. So all the time we're doing this, he's needling me about, you really got to get into the restorative justice game. I mean, it's part of this family of alternative dispute resolution. You really have to do this. Dinners, car rides, and he's always after me. So finally there's an opportunity. He says, there's a group coming from Vermont. We're gonna put on a big training, several days. I want you there. Great. I was, and I'd been working in the field of mediation, alternative dispute resolution for over 20 years. I thought, if there's anybody who's ready to do this work, I'll give it a try. RJ, new kinds of ideas on justice, I'm in. And by lunchtime of the training, I was shocked at just how uncomfortable I was. That my stomach was churning, this idea about, well, what do we do with guilt, and somebody's got to be punished. And I was shocked at the stuff that was bubbling in me. And it became apparent that there was a lot for me to learn in the training. And there was a lot to offer. There was a lot that was going to be challenged in my own heart, even after doing this kind of work for a long time. So I was debriefing the experience with David, talking to him about some of my resistance that was bubbling. And I recalled my first RJ story. And it was when I worked in a school working with peer mediators, students who were dealing with conflict at school. My friend, just call her Anne, was a school nurse. And she called me upset, which she often did, and said, we have an issue at the school, can you come down? And I'm from Delaware County, so I said, sure, I'll be right there. And it took me, nearly an hour to get to the school because it's Delaware County. And we drove out, and her door was closed, not her practice. She lets me in. She's clearly upset, so much so that I thought maybe it was something beyond a school dispute. I said, Ann, what's going on? And she reaches into her desk drawer, and she pulls out this crumpled piece of paper that had been traveling. You could tell that it had been weathered a bit. And there was a matrix on the paper drawn. And down one side was students' names. There was 6 or 7 male names that was on the paper. And on the top side, there were these bizarre categories. It said face shot, gut shot, leg shot, dick shot. And I'm looking at this, and you see these names, and then you see these hash marks. So what you were seeing was somebody's name and how many gut shots, and somebody's name and how many face shots. And what we were actually looking at was a contest, that these students had picked one victim, and they had decided that what they were going to do was, when they could get away with it, they would punch him in the face or kick him in the groin. And every time they got away with it, they got a hash mark on the paper, and they got points for this game. And someone found the paper. And it came to light how this kid was being victimized. It was shocking. And what made it more so was that it was Anne's son, Simon. And she was distraught because we had been doing this kind of work for many years. And what she said to me was, I'm shocked that even after doing this for so long, I can't even protect my own son. So the school made a mess of it. They called the police, and in came the police, and they were arresting these 6th and 7th grade boys, and ended up going through a family court process. And one of our local judges was handling it, and I was there to be a support team for Simon. And we had practiced what we thought was going to happen in court. And the judge said, I'm ready. So all the students were managed together. They were all called in together. And the judge said, I'm ready to figure out the sanctioning portion of this. And she asked Simon to stand, and she said, Simon, I want your input before I go forward as to what should happen here. And there was a long pause, and I almost got up at that point. I almost got up to give him sort of the supportive arm on the shoulder thing. And she said, you understand? And he said, yes. And she said, well, what do you think is going to help? And he takes a big breath, and Simon says, I want them to come to my house for dinner. And I thought, I think he misunderstood the question, And I was going to get up and do a correction for him, thinking, shackles or a stretching table or, or what are you looking for here? And he continued, and he said, I want them to meet me in the context of my family and the people who love me. And I think that if these guys see me with my grandmother, that they won't be able to treat me this way. And I was stunned. I didn't, not quite know how to react. And I think the judge was a bit stunned, and she thought for a few seconds, and she said, okay, I'll consider that. She says, so what we have is the option of traditional probation for the students that were involved, or the students can go through a mediation and go to dinner at Simon's house. And what we had was, of the 7 involved, 3 took Simon up on the dinner invite, and 4 chose to go the traditional route. And let me give you the anecdotal outcome of what this was. Of the 4 that went through probation, I know Simon well enough. He was someone that was a peer educator with me, worked summers. Of the 4 that went through the traditional process, many of them stayed disconnected and adversarial to him, feeling that they were victimized by what had happened. Of the 3 that went to dinner with Simon, 2 of them became advocates with Simon. They forged a relationship together. One stayed sort of neutral and sort of in between the groups, and the 2 of them really forged a connection with him, and I would think to this day we're still connected to Simon. Now, Anne, on the other hand, when I came out of the courtroom and I was beaming, I was thinking, what an amazing kid. Look at the lesson he just taught all of us, about justice and about healing. And I was jumping, my heart was coming out of my chest. And when Anne turned around and faced me, she was furious. And she says, dinner for these little bastards. Are you kidding me? She hadn't quite made the jump to restorative justice yet, She said, I have a special X-lax-laden chocolate pie I'm going to make those bastards, you know. For me, what I like about the core of the story is what I've gotten a chance to do with David on campuses and with individuals and communities is given us a training opportunity where folks can confront their ideas about what really will make a situation better when we've had criminal activity or people who've been injured or hurt. Well, how can we really heal? And it's been a great voyage together to try to take it to different folks and find out what we can do to help folks learn the skills. So when we were brainstorming after David's talk last night, David Kaczynski's talk last night, and he was sort of leaning towards restorative justice but said, oh, no, I'm not sure, I'm not totally sold, I'm not sure how that works. We said, well, what's the plan for today? I said, David, let's teach them a little bit. Let's give them their own experience and let you guys decide for yourselves. So what we're going to do is actually give you a few film clips to work with today, and then actually put you in a simulation and give you a chance to say, how would you repair the harm of an honest, a true life scenario that happened on Skidmore campus? And give you a chance to roll with it, and then have your own thoughts about restorative justice and how it might apply to the things that you face. So that's what we have scheduled for the day. Yes? So were we going to go with the Gandhi? We're going to go with Gandhi, yeah. All right, you want you to introduce it? Oh, no, actually, I know you're on top. So. We're going to show you a clip from Gandhi. And what you need to know about this film, this moment in the film is there is violence and riots spreading all throughout India at this point. And Gandhi says, you don't deserve a democracy. And he goes on a hunger strike. He says, if my people can't get themselves under control, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. And so what you're seeing is that moment when folks are wrestling with the idea that Gandhi is going to possibly die because he's waiting for them to get the riots under control. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to take your reactions to the film. So if you wouldn't mind just saying a first name and what catches your attention when you watch the film? What's your reaction to what you just saw? Don't be bashful, and you got to go fast because we're going to collapse 3 days of training into 90 minutes. So let's go. Yep.
What captured me was the forgiveness that I think the father was struggling with at the end, toward the end.
Excellent, thank you. And huge concept for restorative work. What's the role of forgiveness, redemption? Yep, wonderful.
It wasn't in the clip, but it's Gandhi's mantra of an eye for an eye and the world is blind. So
yeah,
that was just like it solidified that for me.
Excellent. That when we dump punitive sanctions on top of a bad situation, sort of that rolling idea that we sort of pretend that it makes things better when we see that often these negative sanctions are often just heaping on more harm. Excellent. Please.
I think the father of the boy really needed someone to recognize his pain, and the only way he could do it was lashing out in anger, and he wanted to kill, but really what he needed was healing of his pain from the loss of his son.
Awesome. And we had this discussion about the human side of revenge, like talking about what do we do with that? Because it's just as like mercy and forgiveness. Well, revenge comes from us as humans as well. So what do we do with this? Wonderful. Somebody else? Something that got your attention in the clip? Please, up front.
I was just going to follow up on what she said. How often do we ask someone why they did something and address that? Someone's acting in a certain way, they're stealing, they've killed someone. How often do we stop and ask why and address that? Do we really want it to stop? If we do, then why don't we ask that more often and address it?
I think that's a great point. And one of the central features of restorative justice is the storytelling process that enables people to talk about how they came to the situation, what they were thinking at the time. And it is such a profound contrast to the way we do the courtroom process, where all of that is a negotiation process, particularly the plea bargaining process, where it is, a prosecutor saying, well, listen, if you do this, then I'll give you this. And defense attorney saying, well, no, we can't do that, but if we did this, what about can we get this? And nowhere in that conversation is what is the meaning of the tragedy? What is the meaning of the harm that was caused? I'm trying to imagine any criminal courtroom in America where you had someone who has killed a child and the sentence is adopting another child and raising that child. It's just inconceivable in how we think about criminal offending and how we think about justice. So for me, this clip is very paradoxical. On the one hand, when I listen to Gandhi, I think, God, that's so wise, and how did you think of that so quickly? And what a beautiful solution to this. So it feels very natural in a way, and so true. And on the other hand, it's so radically different than how we think about justice. So we show this clip, and we could certainly talk much more with you about it, but we're gonna move on. But I just want to highlight that the reason we show it is to show that the contrast in restorative justice in some ways requires a big shift in thinking about justice, and in other ways it seems very natural, very human, very much about let's just ask why you were doing what you were doing at the time and see what comes naturally and next. What we want to do, are we going to jump right in to the next one? I think
Absolutely,
we should. Okay,
yeah.
so what we're going to do is we're going to show another clip. This one's a little bit longer. It's just 8 minutes, so it's not too long. But it is a clip from a documentary capturing an actual restorative justice conference. So we think that the best thing to do to understand restorative justice is to see it in action. Restorative justice, there are a variety of restorative justice practices, but the central feature of all of them is having a trained facilitator or facilitators host a conversation between an offender and a victim. And it can expand from there. We often add other impacted parties and support people. And the goal is always twofold. First is the storytelling part that helps us understand what harm was caused by the offense. And so that everybody has a full understanding of that. And then the second part is, what do we do in response to that harm? How do we heal that harm? How do we repair it? How do we rebuild trust between these parties who have become, as David was talking about last night, so disconnected from each other, and yet they all have this incident in common. So the case is explained in the beginning, so we don't need any introduction to it. The clip just shows a portion of the conference where they're going through that storytelling process and identifying the harm.
Community for implementing some form of restorative justice, and it seemed pretty cathartic for them. Just the first thing that popped into my mind, though, and I'm going to try and be really sensitive about this, is that I looked at these kids, and they're 6 male children. They're teenagers. They're white. I'm going to assume that they're heterosexual. They are pretty privileged. They have a lot of dominant identities. So this lovely rural community, of course, wants to take care of their kids. These are all parents and educators that are very upset, and they burned a bridge. They didn't murder someone. But I just have to wonder, would this work if you changed one of their identities? Just a little bit. Yeah. Any of them. What would have been different?
So the question is, who is justice for? And does everybody have access to justice? So it's a central question. In restorative justice, the question is always, who needs to be there? Who should be participating? And that's a central question that cuts across all of these issues. So fair enough, we need to examine access to opportunities and explore where the possibilities are. It's interesting. I've watched restorative justice programs unfold across this country and in other countries, and it's fascinating to see the variations. There are inner city programs in Albany. There's a restorative justice program that's largely focused in the Arbor Hill neighborhood, so it's predominantly black. There's a pretty fascinating restorative justice domestic violence program in New Mexico that's largely Hispanic. There are various traditions in restorative justice. One of the traditions or sources of restorative justice comes from New Zealand, and the model, the name of the restorative justice practice is called family group conferencing, which is kind of an odd phrase, but it's a rough translation of a Maori term for a Maori indigenous justice process, and the Maori in New Zealand are like Native Americans here, the disproportionately involved Native people in the justice system, and it was an attempt to reconnect the Maori to a justice process that they would relate to that might be effective for them, and then translated into the New Zealand system and over to Australia and beyond. So it has been implemented in a variety of settings and conditions, which is pretty cool.
In the back, there it goes. Other reactions to what you saw in the film? Blue shirt by the camera.
Yes, I couldn't help but notice the 6 young men, you know, the remorse, the shame. I term it the process of mortification that they're going through. And I understand that this is restorative justice, as you explain it, as you expose it, is more about the victim, you know, and the management of their emotions, of the trauma, you know, that they've gone through. And then when you bring those two elements together, you know, it's, you know, it makes the process work. But I'm looking at 6 young men in deep, deep, deep shame. And I'm saying, what is the process now for them? Because at every point, from the offender's perspective, we're told that you have to move forward. But we're talking about a traumatizing event as this, and then immediately they go into this guilt and shame process. And what is it that helps them be able to manage through that? Because it has the ability, as we all well know, to go the other way.
Yep.
And
So thank you for bringing that up. First of all, that highlights one of the other major oppositions between traditional criminal justice and restorative justice, because in traditional criminal justice, the message to defendants is always profess innocence, deny responsibility, take responsibility for nothing, right? We're taught that outside criminal justice too. You know, you get in a little fender bender, or in any situation, we're repeatedly told, don't expose yourself in any way, deflect responsibility, minimize responsibility. That process is counterproductive to the journey that I think offenders need to take in terms of taking responsibility, expressing remorse, and then moving on, reconnecting with the community. So one of the major theorists of restorative justice is an Australian law professor. His name is John Braithwaite. And he draws the contrast between stigmatizing shame and reintegrative shame. And what he says is that shame is a very powerful emotion and a very important emotion. And it could be a double-edged sword. So if that emotion is experienced in a social context of shunning or outcasting, then it's destructive. Destructive to the offender, destructive to everyone involved. However, if that emotion is experienced and expressed in a context of social support, it can be transformational. And it's the pathway beyond denial of responsibility, a kind of like repression or suppression of what happened. It's a way of facing head-on what happened. When that boy says, I felt like I was a bad role model. I have a younger brother. That's an expression of shame, but it's also a statement about his understanding of his place in the family and his place in the community, that he has a choice in that moment. If he says, this was no big deal, it was just a piece of property, nobody got hurt, all those kind of minimizing statements, it was he's the one who poured the gasoline and he's the one who lit the match, I was just there, all that kind of defensive denial, that does not set him up to be the person he wants to be. And he said, the person I want to be is a role model. And the way for him to be a role model is to say, yes, I did this, I feel bad about this, here's what I'm going to do to show you that I can be a good role model. Here's my plan for the future. That's the transformation. So shame is crucial to this process, but it has to be undertaken in the context of social support.
Yep. Please. Just want to say that David addressed that in his comments last night as well, not being identified by this behavior or by the incident, that doesn't become our identity. It's talking about a process that gives us the ability to transform out of that label. And it's not the Unabomber label like he was talking yesterday, but it's talking about how do you get back to being the brother? How do you get back to being a family member and a community member? So, please.
Yeah, I just give you a different perspective to liven up the conversation. I think the only reason why they were sorry is because they got caught. And that's the reason why they're sorry. Sitting around like that, and God forbid if they ran over a squirrel. Now you got these guys, the best way to restore justice here is to put them in jail for a while, and more importantly, if not jail, restore that bridge out of their own pocket and make them suffer for what it was a bridge, that's all it was. It's gone, it's over with. What did they do when the Trade Center came down? I mean, this is silly. I mean, trying to make some. I know I'm going away. You have your own ideas on this example, but this here was a bad example, my opinion. And my heart goes out. But a bridge to sit around to talk about was silly. These people need to be punished.
So, there are a variety of things we can respond to there. One is that restorative justice has been used in a variety of contexts, everywhere from kindergarten classrooms and not sharing a toy to murder cases where family members of victims have met with the murderer, and in fact, it's been used in a fascinating way in Rwanda as tens of thousands of people, were in prison after committing genocide, were being released and returning to their home villages where they would be living next door once again to families where they had butchered family members with machetes. And so they were petrified, really, about how this was going to go. How were these thousands and thousands of people going to be able to live in these small villages across this country? And the process that they undertook was very similar in terms of there's only one thing to do. It's to sit down in a circle and talk about the meaning of that event, the way in which people participated, their understanding of their responsibility, their expressions of remorse, their requests for forgiveness, their hearing of the impact that they had on those communities. So I think that the also underlying your point is, what is the wake-up call? That are we left with, I don't care about what happened, I just care that I got caught. How do we move from that place, that defensive position, to I actually do care about what happened, about what my role was, about what impact I had on other people? And I think the pathway to that is to hear other people's stories. So when someone else says, I cared about that bridge is really important to me, personally I might not care about that bridge, but all of a sudden I learned something about this other person and about what they cherished. And then I feel bad, right? That I've taken something away that they cared about. That moment of empathy and connection is the restorative process in this model.
Yeah, other hand, Sue. I just want to say I feel you. This is where I was at lunchtime on my first experience, and I didn't know what to do with my sense for justice and my anger and wanting something. And I think it was around that table that David said, well, in some ways you have to pick. They're not going to build the bridge if they're in jail, right? And the idea is to say, you have to talk about separating some of this out to say, how do we address the harm? You know, how do we do it? And I think David just said something very powerful for me, and that is that these young men may come in thinking, I'm angry because I'm afraid because I got caught. But there's something about the circle, and it's about in telling the story that they transition. When they find out how they have affected each other. That's the cases that we get to do, watching folks come in. They come in one place, and they hear the harm that they've done. They understand the nature of the impact, and suddenly there's this desire to be part of healing, rather than just trying to get away from consequence. So let's take some of the other hands. Back there, I see you. Go ahead, back there, please.
I understand that people have a lot of anger when it comes to certain situations, but I don't believe jail and prisons are always the answers, especially something like this. These children could have had some type of preventative program for instead of going to prison or jail. It is a crime, but I think prison is not the answer for that crime right there. I think there could have been something like community service or something they could have done to repay for the bridge to be built. But there are a lot of serious crimes out there, but I still think we can find better answers and solutions, especially preventative before it even gets to the prisons. Programs, something for the kids in the community to help the families, stop the addiction. We got issues out there, but I don't always think prison and jail is the answer to everything that's going on.
I just think it's a great response, because if you think of the menu that's available to folks once they get in the criminal justice system, probation and incarceration is very thin. You're talking about creating customized responses to these situations and saying, what can we really do, and getting creative about what we do. So, and that's one of the things that we bump into when we work on campuses. You have administrators who want there to be categories of responses. What do you do on campus when there's been a problem? And David comes in and says, we can do all sorts of stuff. And they generally don't want to hear that answer because they want to have it predictable. They want to have it fit in the box. This is a violation 426A. And under 426A, we can do A, B, or C, and that's it. We don't want anything else. And so that idea back there about talking about how do we customize for these young men is at the core to this. Yep, very good. Please.
I was trained in the spring as a facilitator. As I said to David last night, it was because of what the story he told me. In this particular situation, there's a couple of people who are missing, and it's more of the community voice. I mean, you can sit there and say, I love the bridge, but you need the firefighters who were fighting that fire. You need the Bureau of Tourism to say what that meant to the community.
Yes.
You need other tools in there So when they come up with the answers of how these kids are going to do it, they're going to serve time in the fire department. They're going to raise money to build the bridge. They're going to sit there and work on the bridge themselves. That's the only way to repair the shame. That's the only way to work around this situation. And yes, they're sorry they got caught, but believe me, it is a lot harder in that circle to be sitting around facing the people that you've harmed than it is to just go to jail and say, okay, I'm serving my time. And again, I mean, what good does it do? They only learn worse behavior in jail than they're going to learn in repairing the situation.
Excellent. You pick the next one, you get the mic. A lot of times with students on college campuses, when we're just doing simulations, we're training, we put them through a simulation and they play the role of the bad guy, quote unquote, right?
I just wanted to add, the Perry model is the one we saw in Rochester and we got trained in. They had 10 years of restorative justice in Rochester.
Excellent. And so you have people who are just taking on the role. It's a role play. And they look at David and they go, I'd rather go to like some sort of administrative hearing. This sucks. I don't, listen to everybody talk about how I've been impacted. Are you kidding me? And so the sense that somehow they're getting off easy, that idea, just doesn't bear out to what we experience, even in just simulations, watching people roll with it. I had a chance to do some restorative circles at Denison University around DWI cases, student athletes in DWI cases. And when they met people, they thought, nobody got hurt, what's the deal? But suddenly they're meeting with administrators and people who live in the community and folks who have lost other folks, surrogate victims say, I've lost family members of drunk drivers. Let's talk about what the potential is here. Very powerful circles. Yeah, please.
I'm struck by a couple of things. The first thing that struck me was the fact that you have 6 presumably white middle-class boys, and not one of them thinks about anything other than setting a fire. And it's just, no thought about consequences, no thought about, what may happen, who might get hurt, maybe we'll burn ourselves to death. Nobody says, what a stupid idea, let's go back to the movies. I mean, it's just, there's this kind of, and you see this in boys until they get to be about 30. That's why they're all killed in car accidents at 18 and 20, because they don't think ahead. And as we get more and more sophisticated as lawyers and as a system, I think people are going to spend more time looking at brain development. But if this is a wonderful example of 6 people who would think would have enough sense not to burn a bridge down, would find something else to do on Saturday night, and not one of them says anything about, well, I had second thoughts, or I suggested we didn't do this. It's all just, oh, well, somebody made a stupid idea, so we went and did it. The other thing that struck me is this wonderful scene here where this boy, you can actually watch the pain on his face as his father cries about where his father went wrong. What didn't I do as a parent? I have 2 sons, so I have this problem of emotion. What didn't I do? Where did I fail that my son would put me here? And you can watch the boy's face, which is very interesting, whether it's a true thing or an act. But if you can watch his face as he is, you can see him dying inside.
Well, so let me just respond to that latter point, and because I think that's really important, that highlights how this is not the traditional adversarial process. Because you have the father who's on the side of the son, who is, in a way, holding the son most accountable. The son is feeling the most pain in the presence of the crying father, of the disappointing the father, that is probably more powerful. He'll walk away and never want to disappoint his father ever again, because he knows what it's like to see his father. He probably had never seen his father cry right before. So that is a takeaway for him that is very powerful. And that's not prosecutor or defense adversarial system. This is a person playing a multi-dimensional role. And this process is about finding people to play roles. The father was not asked to come in to advocate for his son in this process. The father was asked to come in to talk about what it was like what it's been like for him to go through watching his son get caught and go through this process. And that's a learning experience for all involved. And that also speaks to the, will that son think about consequences of his behavior in the future? He's more likely to do so having been woken up to the fact that consequences do happen.
I just wanted to share that something very similar happened to me about a year ago that you mentioned happened to one of the Skidmore students, except for all of us were home and my roommate woke up and they were armed. So she was actually assaulted and it was really hard. And the only support that I felt that we had was the detective saying, we're going to get them, and the prosecutor saying, we're going to put them away for as long as possible. And I felt pressured into writing a victim statement, asking for a long jail sentence. And after about 6 months passed and that initial need for revenge went away, I thought about what I wrote and what I'm going to be doing this year at Mount McGregor. And I feel differently now, but I didn't feel that there was any other way for me to feel better about what happened. And they were all just sentenced, and they all got 9 years each. And all I can think about now is their futures, and I don't feel better about it. So from the perspective of a victim, you know, it's not just about the perpetrator.
It's a very strange psychology that says your healing is predicated on inflicting the pain of another, that their experience of pain is going to help you feel. I mean, I don't know what kind of therapeutic model would, you know, create a system like that. So if we backed up and just said, let's deal with your pain, about this painful experience, let's figure out what to do. A classic phrase in restorative justice is that you create a circle and that you put the incident in the center of the circle, and everybody looks at the incident from their perspective and says, here's how I was affected, and here's what I need to be whole again. So everybody's involved, offenders, support people, victims, community. And that is so different than putting the offender in the center of the circle and have everybody point their fingers at the offender and say, this is what I think we should do to you, right? So when you put the incident in the center of the circle and you ask what now, is very different than what do we need to do to you.
I got a nudge time-wise. We're gonna shift because this has been such a rich conversation. It's pushing us time-wise. So this is what we're gonna have you do. Is together we're going to, in large group, we're gonna brainstorm what are the kind of harms that you saw expressed. You have to frame it as a harm. What harm it was caused by these young men and their behaviors. And we're gonna brainstorm together. We're gonna put them up, and then we're gonna turn you into the restorative justice group at your tables, and you're going to talk about what kind of sanctions could you put in place, what kind of responses could you put in place that would foster healing for the situation. Is that okay? So let's popcorn it right now, which means just when you're ready, tell us what kind of harms was expressed on the film, or what could you guess based on what you saw? So we'll take a few, just hands. Harms. What were the harms? Yeah, please.
One of the harms was in bullying. You mentioned before there were 6th and 7th grade boys who grouped together. They bullied some student, Simon, I think it was. I was just wondering, could we train students? I mentioned before, the younger the better, not when they're in high school, maybe grade school, maybe even freshmen, first graders, second graders, and teach them not how to get together and bully like the 6th and 7th graders got together to bully. Teach these young kids when they're in first grade, second grade, how to unite when they see bullying. All come together right away and defend the kid who's getting bullied.
Excellent. So actually, you're ahead in the agenda. That's the question phase. Short answer is there's phenomenal work being done around you in that area about talking how students can respond in positive ways. Absolutely, it's being done. And we can talk about resources when we close. So what we want to do right now is, akin to this story, what are the specific harms that this community experienced because of the decision of the 6 guys who burned down the bridge? Please.
Well, as I said, there was firefighters that could have been put in danger.
Great. So can we we're going to put a risk to firefighters. Good. Other ideas? This is what we're going to do. We're just going to pop them up. Other responses. What's the harm to this community? Please.
A loss of...
Family members feel betrayed. We'll put that up behind you.
A loss of history for the community.
Excellent. Loss of history for the community. Great. The loss of the bridge. So literally that, you say, literally if we're talking about people, it's more expensive if they're going 6 miles down the road to get across this river. Like talking about the loss of transportation, right? Convenience. Write that down. Yep, please.
I believe it was a great loss of trust in the relationship of the family.
Excellent. Loss of trust within a family. How can my boy do this? Like you saw that on some of the faces. I thought we covered this, that arson was something we don't do as a family, How could it be that we're still working on that one? Excellent. Other hands? Yep, please.
Tourism?
Tourism. Fabulous. Maybe this town was part of the circuit for these folks who travel and take pictures of of all these different bridges, and now that deli doesn't sell their sandwiches, or that bed and breakfast doesn't rent rooms. Excellent. Please.
I guess maybe with that pride, the loss of pride.
Excellent. That this was something that distinguished us from being just another little Pennsylvania town, is one that's on the covered bridge circuit. Great. Please.
I'd go off of loss of family trust to also loss of trust within the whole community.
Like that feeling of loss of innocence, like we moved here because we wanted to be in a small community where they delivered milk every day, and instead we're waking up to this. You got one up front here.
Loss of futures, the harm to their futures, the perpetrators and the community.
Excellent. We're going to cut it off right there. So we're talking about the potential of these young men. Like we don't know much about them other than they burned the bridge right now and that they have parents that love them. Right, but what else are they good at? Or, is any of these going to be great teachers? Or are they going to build something spectacular? Or find a cure for common cold? We don't know yet. All right, so we're going to turn it over to you at the table. You got the list. Do we want to assign them different ones? No. Don't everybody do the first one, okay? Look at the list as a table. I want you to come up with sanctions that would address the harms you've identified. Inside the harms are needs. There are needs that are being expressed by those harms. Like, can you feel the flip? If there's a risk to the firemen, we want to talk about meeting a need for what? Safety, yes. Safety and security. Can you feel the flips? So the key to the sanction is to find the flip. It's about what is the need that's expressed by that, and what are we going to do to help foster that need? Yes? At that table.
Open opportunity for these young men to get some very important skills, like rebuilding the bloody bridge.
Excellent. Excellent. Right? Maybe some of them will have a future in putting together something with wood and shingles. Get together in your small groups and come up with some sanctions. 5 minutes. You got 5 minutes to fix the world, so get going.
I think that they should do some type of history. Everyone thinks it is very important, but they don't really understand the history. So for the community, so that they can say, oh, this is important because we researched it.
Maybe referring some type of community service work, maybe with the fire department or the historical society within it.
To address each one? I was looking at one of the other ones because I thought everybody's going to talk about that.
That's a good, and especially address the harm of arson, and like reckless behavior, like thinking about consequences. I was thinking about what happened to you, Did those, whoever gave those guys, whoever went into your apartment, how far ahead, were they on drugs, were they drinking, whatever, but whoever sat down and said these are the consequences for them and for you, it said. So in this talk to high school kids, to talk about, teach kids, how do you foresee the consequences? It's going to go away.
Watch out. That's a sneaky one. See?
But we weren't talking about it.
Smack him in the head and make him rebuild the bridge.
That's what you're looking for.
My sister went to
Okay, we ready?
Oh, I didn't know he was recording us. Okay.
Oh, no, and what you can do, you can actually have a temporary erected right next to it so that there's transportation available to everybody, but right next to it you rebuild the bridge.
And rebuild it as authentically as possible.
But the new bridge can be built in a very short period of time. They just get the Army Corps of Engineers and put up a daily bridge. It takes them about 24 or 36 hours to do it, and then they can use it.
Students still commute as well.
Travel 6 miles to go and get a quart of milk.
More stress on the community to have to go all around what they just passed through every day.
That bridge was probably between a lot of our households of that community and the firehouse. So
Yeah, that's true.
it's placing a lot of other homes in danger by not having the bridge. Yeah.
Right.
But I come to wonder how big the bridge was. It was a wooden bridge.
One more minute.
Old. It was an old, but it was safe enough for the community to pass by.
Okay, let's have a very brief report out from the tables before we close up, because we're all hungry for lunch. So I want to take these just see what little glimpses of ideas you had. The first one on the list, I can't see it, but I think it was the risk to firefighters. So what, did anybody talk about that? What might happen out of this case that would reduce the risk to firefighters? Anybody have any idea? Yeah.
Well, as I was trying to say, there's obviously other things that happen when the firefighters are called. Say in this particular scenario, somebody didn't get help at another situation and died because CPR wasn't administered. Maybe they, the police chief says this to the kids, and each of them have to learn CPR in order to fulfill some of their mission. Perhaps they need to go and clean out the fire tower at the where they do practices, or some other thing that's going to make them really understand, what a firefighter has to deal with and the risks to the firefighter and the community.
Okay, so three great ideas there. One is, the last point was, help these kids understand the nature of what firefighters do and the kind of danger. So help them further understand this nature of this situation so they could do some kind of activity to learn more about that. You also said they could do some kind of community service for the fire department, helping support their mission. And then the third thing was very interesting. You said that they could learn CPR because firefighters might not always be available, and they could be in a situation where they could offer assistance. So very creative ways, all related to this problem of firefighters being put at risk. So you see how this works, that the brainstorming starts to come up with ideas that are unique to the situation and come out of the group itself. What's second on the list?
Family betrayal.
Family betrayal. What could these boys do to regain some family trust or earn their way back into the good graces of their families? Anybody have any ideas about that? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, we were just kind of brainstorming on, first of all, a constant relationship, time. It takes time to restore trust and build back in the family. And then we talked a little bit about responsibility and leadership training. You know, sometimes, you know, there's a theory, once you know, you can't go back to not knowing. So, you know, once leadership principles are uncovered, you know, you can't go back to not knowing. With an incident that has been as motivating and traumatizing as this, you kind of really want to stick or kind of grab hold of something that you know is correct and stay to it at the risk of not ruining or destroying, you know, the family ties and so forth. So you find these things to grab onto, and they help you make better decisions and independent decisions, you know, down the road, future.
So that's cool. That's about your family will feel better about you if you take hold of your future, if you gain some skills, if you learn some leadership qualities, if you show yourself to be something more than you've been, your family's going to be reconnected to you. They're going to be proud of you again. So you've done something that made them disappointed in you. Now do something that will make them feel proud of you. Pretty cool, right? So it's about the personal development of each of these individual kids, but also about repairing the relationship in the family. So I
want him to look at that mechanism. I just think about, his first answer was spend time with family. You said there's been a betrayal, so you spend time. And when doing that, maybe we talk about leadership, we talk about building assertiveness, but his answer is spend time with family. Think of how many sanctions. The first thing that we do is separate folks from what's important to them. You break a training rule on a basketball team, you don't play, you don't practice. And what we're doing is you're turning that upside down and saying, no, we're talking about that if your connection to the team is important to you, you break a training rule, maybe you go with the team to an AA meeting. You spend time with that community and you rebuild. So just an awesome response.
Okay, so we are out of time. Does anybody want to make any kind of last global comment or question before we close? Yes, please.
I think beyond the scene, I think we have to remember certain things, especially in the family dynamic that David was talking about last night. You don't always get all the answers you want answered. Things don't always happen, but families, I think, are so important in this. In the Kaczynski family, there's never going to be a reconnect with David, you know, and Ted. It's just not going to happen. And there's certain things you have to accept. Mental illness is a big thing. Over 50% of the people in jail have some sort of mental illness that's not being cared for. So, you know, when you're in these situations, there's a lot of different things that can come up to change the dynamics. But I think in this particular situation, there's a lot of hope. You know, these young men's futures can be turned around. Time with the family is important. If the father and sons work on the bridge together, that builds trust. That, you know, lots of different things that can be done to make this a positive situation.
Thank you. Last comment?
Well, I just wanted to, the question came up, what can be done, how do we get involved, you know, marching orders, you know, call to action, is that the good news is that there is a tremendous amount of good work being done already, and there are folks all over, communities all over, and locally, nationally, that are doing this work, that are interested in it. David is a fantastic resource. If it's being done, especially on a college campus, you want to know, you know, whether they're doing sexual violence on college campuses, whether they're specializing to deal with issues on alcohol, whether they're doing housing disputes or race and dignity issues. If you have specific questions, he can tell you, not only can he tell you where it's happening, he can even give you their contact information and put you in touch. And they have been logging through their STAR project, collecting hard data about what is the actual impact of these circles on communities. And so they're using campuses as a way to study really what is this impact and how can we make it measurable. So you got a local resource. I'm going to encourage you to take advantage of it and stay connected. Yeah.
My only last question is, how do you keep the prosecutor out of the circle so you can't use all that later prior?
You know, in many places, DAs have been actively involved in creating restorative justice circles as alternative sentencing mechanisms. And that's actually true in Albany. The restorative justice program is out of the prosecution, the DA's office, David Sora's office. There was a community in Canada that was overrun by sexual abuse, and the district attorney was heavily involved in creating circles of healing around that. So they're not necessarily opposed to the process. I think that my last comment that I would like to make is that if, you know, this gathering has had a lot of elements of critique of the system, as it should, but what I like about today is the message of hope that it is possible, that there are opportunities out there for doing something different, doing things better. What a special possibility to have a tragic incident that is transformed and healing for everyone involved. That it's not a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other side loses, but that everyone gets something out of this process. So I think, well, we got one last, if you want to have you get the last word, and after you say something, we're going to lunch. Oh, great.
So if anyone lives in Albany County and they're interested in being on that board, let me know, because I'm recruiting volunteers for it, and we have a training in October, so that'd be a good way to actually be part of restorative justice project. So just let me know, and I can take down your information.
Excellent. Thank you for your work.